Hello, everyone. Uh, and this is such a nice green setting for this book. I'm so thrilled. And a backdrop. I was actually just saying outside I should have worn green too, but I think there's enough to go around for now. So this is a book I absolutely love. And maybe I'll just start with an impressionistic thing about how I first read it. So earlier this year at the beginning, Janice and I were on a panel in Kolkata, and I knew that she was traveling with this book at the time, and I thought, let me quickly read it in 2 or 3 days before going to Kolkata. And I started, and I found very quickly that this is not the kind of book one rushes through. So how many of you have read the book here? Okay, a good number, fantastic. Uh, so I found very quickly it's not the kind of book that one rushes through. So I then, after coming back from Kolkata, I took 2 weeks at leisure to savor the book, and it was just such a rich and thrilling experience. So thank you, Janice, for writing the book. And I also just wanted to say about the book that as many of you know, it presents a very different vision of the world altogether. So it has this thing where its parts come together, and it suggests a different approach, a different way of looking at the things around us. And I also want to say that altogether it becomes a commentary also on the philosophy of science, I think, and of botany. And so we'll be talking a little more about that. So I just want to, for those of you who haven't read the book, I think about half of you seem to have read the book, but for those of you who haven't, I just want to give a quick introduction to the book. There are four protagonists in the book. And going chronologically, there's Carl, who turns out to be Linnaeus, well-known or notorious for his classifying of the living world, and who's known as the father of taxonomy, and probably the patriarch of taxonomy would be a good way to describe him as well. And we have Johann, who turns out to be Goethe, the poet and novelist, and it turns out he had a keen interest in science as well. He had his opinions about Newton's theories about color and about how Linnaeus dealt with the living world and so on. And then we have Evelyn. Linnaeus was, of course, in the first half of the 18th century. Goethe was roughly 50 years after him. And we come to Evie, who was in the 1910s, approximately, I think, when the book finds her as a young woman who's traveled from England ostensibly to find a husband in India, but she's really here to do botany. And this is a book of travel and adventure and exploration as well, because it shows Linnaeus on a tour of Lapland, his expedition which was quite central to the work that emerged. And it shows Goethe on a trip to Italy, where again, he's formulating his ideas about botany and about how everything is a manifestation of a leaf and so on. And Evie, of course, has studied botany at Cambridge, and she has a mission in her head, and a secret mission. We will not tell you what it is. And then there's Shai, who is contemporary, I guess, and is also on an exploration because she's moved from Delhi back to Shillong in an attempt to find roots in more ways than one, perhaps. So I'll just stop there and I'll ask you about the form of the book, because while I took these characters chronologically, in the book they're not. So the book is shaped like a bud almost, with Linnaeus in the middle, and that section written in poetry, and extremely accessible, and a lot of it is really witty poetry as well. And then, he is flanked on either side by Johann, and in turn by Evie, and then Shai forms the first section and the last section. So how did this form come about for this book?
Thank you, Srinath. Thank you for your words. So generous, so kind, and thank you for reading the book with such depth and with such care. Thank you all for being here on this rather lovely Bangalore day. And thank you for that question. I begin to engage with form the moment I ask myself, how do I tell this story? How do I tell this story in the most effective way possible? So in other words, how do I place in order all of this information that I have about this story world in the most meaningful, effective way for the reader, for us, right? So in that way, it gestures towards what canvas am I looking at? A short story, a novella, a more expansive novel. And it also gestures very strongly towards structure. Form, for me, is structural, right? And with Everything the Light Touches, I always knew it had to be a novel because there was a big idea at the heart of it, and I thought it needed that kind of ambitious expansion, expansive space within which to explore this big idea. But I had no idea how to go about it. I had these 4 stories, this quartet of stories, and I thought, shall I place them one after the other? I was quite influenced by Shubhangi Swaroop's Latitudes of Longing, another beautiful book. And I thought, shall I place these 4 stories one after another? And they seemed too blocky in that way, too watertight for a story that was trying to conjure connection through time and space and geography. So that didn't seem to work. Then I thought, should I alternate each chapter, start with Shai, Evie, Goethe, Karl, and then so on? And that seemed so messy and so confusing, unnecessarily so. And then I had a discussion with my editor, Rahul Soni, who is so much more than an editor. He really is a life giver to this book. And he asked me, have you considered using a nested structure? A structure that someone like David Mitchell uses in Cloud Atlas, if you've read the book, right? And suddenly something just fell into place. I thought, that's it. That works. Because that kind of nested structure, a story within a story, within a story, within a story, allows for that permeability of ideas through space, through time. It allows for this gentle entanglement that I wanted to conjure for the book. And then, of course, form is also thematic. You think about what is the theme of your book, of your story, and how should that reflect in the form, the shape that it takes. So Linnaeus, as you said, is right at the heart of the book, quite literally so. He forms the spine, because in some ways he is at the heart of the kind of inheritance that we have gained from him, right? In the way that we see the world, we are very Linnaean in nature. We tend to categorize along lines of gender, along lines of nationality and caste and religion, right? So we are a species that is quite obsessed with labeling and boxing. And so Linnaeus falls at the heart of the book, whereas Goethe, Evie, Shai unfurl around him and offer that resistance, that questioning, that pushback. They unfurl around Linnaeus in the way of buds and leaves and flowers. It's also a form, it's a nested structure for sure, but it's also a form that is disrupted by the poetic narrative at the heart of the book. And why is this? Because it's a book, it's a novel that hopes to shift your certainties a bit, that hopes to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable about all the things that you think the way the world is, right? It's questioning, it's asking you to look at the kind of categories that you have in your own life, for others, for yourself. And I hope that by placing a lyric narrative smack bang in the middle of the book, lodged between all of this prose, it leaves you asking, is this a novel? What is a novel, right? So what you thought was a novel, perhaps, you're not so sure about that anymore, yeah?
No, that's beautiful. And the nested structure really worked well for me because it also challenged me at another level. Because at the heart of the book is this theme of, how we of dividing the world into categories, and the more Goethean view of unifying things, seeing wholeness of sorts. It also challenges the reader in a way to, transcend those divisions and try and make a whole of it. And I actually thought that Janice has left small signposts, for example, to do with the word light. There are different resonances around it all through. So there are these sort of tendrils that go across these different sections, which unite them at a higher level of sorts. So I think that speaks beautifully to the theme of the book as well. And coming to another theme of the book, Evie, for example, she was taught by her grandmother to connect with the soil, to grow, and so on. Shai goes back to visit her ailing nanny, and there, when she spends time with the family, she learns to, to tend to, the garden, and so on. And one of the things we were talking about yesterday was how women in this book, they reclaim botany as something that they have been doing traditionally and so on. So can you say a little more about this aspect of it?
Yes, of course. So at the heart of the book, I hope that it raises many questions, but at the heart of the book is a deeply epistemological concern, right? So the book is asking, how do you learn what you learn? How do you gather the knowledge that you gather, right? And it's asking this question because I think it's really important. And I think it's important because how you learn about something shapes and determines the way you relate with that thing. So how you learn about the natural world shapes the way you relate to the natural world. So there is a tussle in the book between this deeply Western, almost, I'm going to go out and say it, very deeply patriarchal Western scientific way of negotiating with the natural world. I wouldn't even use the word negotiate because it's more of an imposition. And the other way, which Goethe and Shai's indigenous communities offer, which is a way of gentler interaction and negotiation with the natural world, right? So there's this tussle. And what I really wish to do is explore how this other space, the Goethean indigenous space, was infinitely more feminine in its approach, right? So whereas a Western scientific pedagogy would insist on competition, on mechanistic sort of ways of looking at the world. The Goethean, the more feminine, the indigenous offers collaboration, imagination, intuition, right? And this tussle was exceedingly important for me to explore precisely because of the kind of state that we find ourselves in at the present moment, right? We speak about climate change, we talk about the ecological crisis. Where does this really, really come from, right? And I know the word crisis seems to make it, appear that the ecological crisis and the climate change crisis is here and now and present and contemporary. But its roots, I find, are much, much further back. It's in this shift that happened perhaps during the European Enlightenment, where this deeply mechanistic, patriarchal way of being in the world took hold, and of course was happily distributed across the globe through the colonial project, right? So in this way, the book is trying to hold out, and I don't really like the word alternative, but it's trying to hold out this space of communion and collaboration that we can choose to opt for, rather than the more sort of, mainstream way of doing things that we have been doing for so long, and it hasn't really left us in the most sort of, sustainable environment, yeah?
Yeah, so linking from this, in the Shai part of the story, when she goes back to visit her nanny,
Yes.
there are two villages there which have an opposing sort of tendency towards development of uranium mining in that area. It seems to be causing, many health issues for many people. And there's one village that, feels that having a road here is going to, help them in so many ways. The sick people can be, like Tansen, you have brought rain, Janice. That, so one village feels that a road is going to be incredibly useful for us, and the other village feels that this is going to be the first step towards this area being ravaged. So that kind of seems to symbolize these two approaches that you talked about in some way, and these are real problems for us because we do have to think of both sides of this.
Yes.
So how do you see it playing out in this Goethean vision? So how do you reconcile these sorts of conflicts?
I mean, I think this particular situation in the book that you bring up of these two villages on opposing sides, because there's a road that's being proposed to be built to their villages, which will join them with Shillong, the very big town in Meghalaya. One village says no, and the other says yes. And why this situation is in some ways simplified, actually, rather than complicated, is that the proposal comes from USIL, the Uranium Corporation of India, and they have offered to build a road into uranium-rich countryside, right? So one village, rightfully so, is deeply suspicious of this act, while the other, through understandable desperation, says, let's just have this road built so that we have access to schools and hospitals mainly, right? And I think that it's very easy in some ways to get caught up in this niggly situation. But the reason why this particular issue is inserted into the book, is placed into the book, is for it to gesture towards a larger problem. And that's what Goethean science urges you to look at context, to look at deep context, to look at long perspectives, right? To not just say, here and now, the issue has erupted. Why has this issue erupted, right? And how long back must we travel to actually really understand the root of the problem, right? And this is it's safe to say, I think, that it's true for even all of us. There are days when we feel we are going through a particular, a mood, a crisis, but why? Is it really about something that happened that day or something much, much long before, right? So the issue gestures towards a larger extractive relationship that has come into being between our species and the planet, right? And that really is the larger view to take into consideration, to try and resolve in some way, because it's no point, as Goethe would tell you, to try and solve a pinprick, when the larger fabric itself needs a reweaving, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you use the idea of colonialism, because since the age of discovery, it seems like in Linnaean fashion, it is being partitioned into smaller and smaller units, where even one part of a nation state can colonize another, and so on.
Absolutely.
And so that is mirrored at so many levels, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that stood out about the book for me was the travel aspect of it. I noticed that almost all of it is written in present tense, right? Including
Yes.
the poems and. And of course, it is a story of exploration and adventure, and there is a transformation in all the characters after they undergo their journeys. So I wanted to ask you about your sort of metaphorical and perhaps literal travel for this book.
Right.
I know there's been a lot of reading, and perhaps you went to places. So
We did.
where did you go,
Yeah.
and how did that change you?
Right. Okay. What a lovely question. So just very briefly on why travel serves as such a particularly important instrument in the novel. Each of the characters, when you encounter them at a point of departure, right? So they're all leaving or about to leave all of them. And you follow their journeys, of course, through the rest of the book, right? And travel becomes this very convenient vehicle to explore a mood of shifting, of movement, in a book that is holding up hope in the form of us being able to acknowledge the fluidity of the world, right? So travel plays into that sense of movement that the book itself is trying to urge you to follow, that the world is always becoming, nature is always naturing, we are always being, right? And so travel offers that, it offers that momentum. And so travel becomes this very deeply inherent part of the stories in so many ways. Travel also forces you to negotiate with the unfamiliar. No? There's so many variables around you that you cannot control. And you try your best, but travel is unexpected. It's newness. It's unfamiliarity. And what better way to get to know your characters than to set them off on a journey? To say, what will you do when you encounter this? Right? Just as we get to know ourselves, I think, more when we travel. Sometimes when we travel with our friends, we get to know them very well. And we think, maybe we'll never travel with them again. Yes. Right? So travel places the characters in this space of newness that they constantly have to negotiate with. And I think that allows for a very rich sort of literary, space. Travel for me, when it comes to this book, oddly enough, I was writing this in the middle of the pandemic. I'd done a little bit of travel before that for research, and that was extremely helpful and extremely, it led to many helpful insights. But I wrote the book stuck at my desk in my little flat in Delhi with the world burning and in chaos around me. And I thought, this is all I have. This is the only thing that makes sense to me. And not just that, what seemed to happen was that the question that I was asking through the book, what is our relationship to the planet, seemed to be echoed in conversations all around me at that time, especially because people were talking about how ecological reasons had led to the pandemic, right? Deforestation, the way that we treat livestock, animals, right? Sort of our extractive economic policies. So there was this strange resonance that was set up at that point at my little desk, even at a time of absolute stillness and constriction. There was transformation and movement on the page.